Greetings and welcome back to Darktime Diaries. I know many of you use this story to sleep, but before do so, do well to comment where you are watching from, and if this is your first time coming across this channel, welcome. We share amazing story that will keep you entertained and coming back for more. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you won't miss out on our next upload. My name is David Cole, and until a year ago my life was as ordinary as it gets. I lived in a small town, worked a 9-to-5 job as a graphic designer, and spent most of my free time hanging out with my close friends Mark and Rejoice. But one ordinary Tuesday afternoon, everything changed. It was a sunny day, the kind where the sky is so blue it feels like nothing bad could ever happen. I had just finished a meeting at work when my phone buzzed. It was Mark. "Hey David," he said, his voice unusually serious. "Do you have a minute? I need to talk." "Of course," I replied. Mark and I had been best friends since high school, and we rarely kept secrets from each other. We met at our usual spot, a small cafe on Main Street. Mark was already there, nervously stirring his coffee. "What's up?" I asked, sitting across from him. He hesitated before speaking. "I've been keeping something from you, and I don't know how to say it." "Just say it," I said, trying to hide my growing concern. He took a deep breath. "I've been struggling. With money, I mean. I borrowed some from the wrong kind of people. And now they're threatening me." I stared at him, stunned. Mark was the responsible one in our group, the guy who always had his life together. "Why didn't you tell me earlier?" I asked. "I didn't want to drag you into it," he said. "But now they're asking for more than I can give. I don't know what to do." I didn't have much savings, but I offered to help him anyway. "We'll figure this out," I said. "How much do you owe?" "1,000, he said, his voice barely a whisper. My heart sank. That was more money than either of us could come up with quickly. "Do they know where you live?" He nodded. "They said if I don't pay by the end of the week, they'll come for me." Rejoice joined us later that evening, and the three of us brainstormed ideas. Selling some of Mark's stuff, taking on extra work, even asking for small loans from family. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The next day, Rejoice called with an idea. "My uncle runs a catering company," she said. "He's short-staffed for this big event on Friday. He's paying well if we can help out." Mark and I agreed immediately. We spent the next 3 days working long hours, washing dishes, setting up tables, and serving guests. It was exhausting, but by Friday night, we had made enough to cover part of Mark's debt. But it wasn't enough. On Saturday, Mark got another call from the people he owed. This time they weren't asking, they were demanding. "They want the money by tonight," he said, panic in his voice. I made a decision I'm not proud of. "We're going to the bank," I said. Out of desperation, I emptied my savings to cover the rest of Mark's debt. It was a painful decision, but I prioritized our friendship over my financial security. That night, we handed the money over to the men in a tense parking lot meeting. I thought we had crossed the worst hurdle. But then Mark changed. At first, he promised to pay me back. Weeks turned into months, and every time I asked, he had a new excuse. He wasn't making enough at his second job, or he needed to pay for other emergencies. Slowly, his tone shifted as if my sacrifice was something trivial. "You didn't have to help me, David," he said one day, as if I'd overstepped by saving him. Our friendship began to unravel. I felt betrayed. Mark wasn't just neglecting his debt. He seemed to forget the lengths I had gone to for him. Meanwhile, I was struggling to rebuild my finances, paying the price for my loyalty. The breaking point came during an argument. I confronted Mark about his lack of effort to repay me, and he lashed out. "Why are you making this such a big deal?" "I didn't ask you to save me," he said, his words cutting deeper than I expected. It shook me to my core. The bond we had shared for years now felt like a one-sided commitment. For the first time, I questioned whether our friendship had been worth the sacrifices I had made. In the end, I made a difficult decision. I told Mark to keep the remaining money. "You don't have to pay me back," I said, my voice steady despite the pain. "But I need you to know this isn't about the money. It's about trust, and you've broken it." Mark was stunned. My decision caught him off guard. I walked away that day, unsure if our friendship could ever be repaired. To my surprise, that act of letting go seemed to wake something in Mark. He began to reflect on his actions and, over time, made genuine efforts to rebuild our friendship. It wasn't easy and it didn't happen overnight, but we eventually found our way back to a place of understanding. Now I carry a lesson with me. Generosity can sometimes cost more than money, and true friendship requires mutual respect and effort. While Mark and I have reconciled, the scars of that experience remain, a reminder of the fragility of trust and the strength it takes to forgive. I grew up in a small town in Nigeria, tucked away from the rush of the big cities. Life there was simple, predictable even, but it wasn't always easy. My family was what you'd call average on the outside, a father, a mother, and 3 kids trying to make the best of life. But what went on behind the walls of our small house was anything but ordinary. Dad, whose name was David, was a large man both in size and presence. He worked as a mechanic, and his hands, roughened by years of fixing engines, were no stranger to violence. Mum, on the other hand, was soft-spoken and kind. Her name was Sarah. She worked as a tailor, stitching clothes for neighbors and friends to make ends meet. I was the eldest, 13 at the time, and my 2 younger siblings, Grace and Daniel, were 9 and 6. Grace adored Mum, always sitting next to her as she sewed. Daniel, the baby of the family, spent his time playing with whatever he could find, sticks, bottle caps, anything. Dad was a different story. He was quick-tempered, and the littlest things could set him off. If dinner wasn't ready when he got home, if Mum didn't answer his questions the way he liked, or if he simply had a bad day at work, we all knew what was coming. He'd yell first, his voice booming through the house like thunder. Then the hitting would start. I remember one night vividly. Mum had spent hours sewing a customer's dress, and dinner wasn't ready by the time Dad walked in. He was furious. Without a word, he grabbed her by the arm and slapped her hard. I could hear the sting of it from where I stood in the corner, holding Grace and Daniel. "David, please?" Mum pleaded, tears streaming down her face. But he didn't stop. His fists and words rained down on her like a storm. I hated him in those moments. I hated the fear that gripped me, the helplessness I felt as I held my siblings, trying to shield them from the horror unfolding in front of us. The next morning, Mum would cover her bruises with a scarf and go back to her sewing, pretending nothing had happened. We all pretended. Neighbors would ask questions sometimes, but Mum always found a way to deflect them. "I fell," she'd say, or "it's nothing serious." But it was serious. The beatings left more than just physical scars. Grace stopped laughing as much, and Daniel started wetting the bed again. I became angry at Dad, angry at Mum for staying, angry at the world for letting this happen. One day, I found Mum crying in the corner of our small room. She was holding a photograph of her and Dad on their wedding day. They looked so happy, so full of hope. I knelt beside her, my anger giving way to sadness. "Mum, why do you stay?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She looked at me, her eyes red and swollen. "Because of you 3, she said. "I don't want you to grow up without a father. I'm doing this for you." I didn't know what to say. I just hugged her, wishing I could take her pain away. Things changed when Grace turned 10. She came home from school one day and found Mum bleeding from a cut on her forehead. Dad had just left for work, and Grace, in her innocence, ran to the neighbor's house for help. Mrs. Agnes, our next-door neighbor, was a no-nonsense woman. She stormed into our house, took one look at Mum, and said, "Sarah, this is enough. You need to leave him." Mum shook her head, but Mrs. Agnes wouldn't hear it. She called some women from the local church, and they rallied around Mum, offering her a place to stay, help with her sewing business, and even a small loan to get back on her feet. Leaving wasn't easy. Dad was furious when he found out, but the women from the church stood firm. They made it clear that if he came near Mum or us kids again, they'd report him to the police. Mum moved us into a small one-room apartment. It wasn't much, but it was ours. For the first time, our home was filled with laughter instead of fear. Mum worked harder than ever, and Grace, Daniel, and I pitched in where we could. Years later, I look back on those days with a mix of pain and pride. Mum taught us what it meant to be strong, to fight for what's right even when it's hard. Dad tried to reach out a few times, but Mum never went back. We still live in that small town, but our lives are different now. Mum runs a thriving sewing business, and Grace and Daniel are doing well in school. As for me, I'm studying to become a social worker. I want to help families like ours to show them that there's a way out, that they can build a life free from fear. Our story isn't perfect, but it's ours. And in the end, love, real love, won. My name is Jake Henderson, and for most of my life, I'd lived in the small, quiet town of Springfield, Illinois. When my dad got a job transfer to Seattle, Washington, I had to leave behind everything I knew, my friends, my school, and the home I loved. Starting over at a new high school as a junior felt like stepping into a storm without an umbrella. From day one, I knew I didn't fit in. Cascade High was massive, with cliques as solid as concrete. I was the new kid, the one no one wanted to bother with, except for a group of boys who seemed to find joy in making my life miserable. They called themselves the Wolf Pack. The leader of the group, Tyler, was tall, intimidating, and had this smirk that made you feel like prey. His second in command, Brandon, was the quiet one but had a mean streak that showed in his actions rather than his words. Then there was Cole, the loudmouth who laughed the hardest at every insult thrown my way. It started with small things, snide comments in the hallway, books knocked out of my hands, and whispers that followed me wherever I went. I tried to ignore it, thinking it would pass, but the bullying only escalated. One day in gym class, Tyler accidentally tripped me during a basketball game, and I landed hard, scraping my knees. The laughter that erupted around me was deafening. "Watch where you're going, loser," Cole hollered, and the entire class joined in. I felt my face flush as I picked myself up, biting back tears. The worst came a few weeks later when they cornered me after school. I had stayed late to finish a science project and was walking home alone. I didn't hear them coming until it was too late. "Hey, Jake," Tyler called out, his voice dripping with mock friendliness. I turned to see the three of them blocking the path ahead. My stomach churned. "What do you want?" I asked, trying to sound braver than I felt. "We just want to talk," Brandon said, stepping closer. But it wasn't just a talk. They shoved me around, laughing as I stumbled. Cole grabbed my backpack and dumped its contents on the ground. Then Tyler pulled out a pocket knife. "Let's give the new kid a little reminder of who's in charge," he said, twirling the blade in his hand. My heart pounded in my chest. "Please don't do this," I managed to choke out, my voice shaking. "Relax, we're just messing around," Brandon said, though his grin told me otherwise. I don't know where I found the courage, but as Tyler stepped closer, I grabbed my backpack, swung it at him, and ran as fast as I could. I could hear their shouts behind me, but adrenaline carried me forward. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest house and banged on the door. An elderly woman answered, her eyes widening as she saw my panicked state. "Are you okay, son?" she asked. "They're after me," I gasped. She quickly ushered me inside and called the police. It didn't take long for the authorities to track down Tyler and his gang. Apparently, they had a history of bullying, though they had never gone as far as they did with me. Witnesses from school came forward, and security footage from nearby stores showed them following me that night. When the case went to court, Tyler, Brandon, and Cole were given harsh sentences, including mandatory counseling and community service. Tyler's possession of a weapon added to his punishment. Their parents were mortified, and the school implemented stricter anti-bullying policies. The experience left scars, both physical and emotional, but it also taught me the importance of standing up for myself and seeking help. I found friends in unexpected places like Josh, a quiet kid in my science class who stood by me when others didn't. Looking back, I wish I had spoken up sooner. No one deserves to feel powerless, and there's always someone willing to help if you let them. Now, as I walk the halls of Cascade High, I hold my head a little higher. The shadows of bullying still linger, but they no longer define me. I don't know why I kept the letter. If I'd thrown it away, I might have been able to forget about it. But now, it sits on my kitchen counter, folded neatly, taunting me every time I walk by. It arrived last week, just after lunch. I was sitting at home in the small house I rent in Marietta, Georgia. It's not much, but it's cozy, a single-story brick house with a porch that creaks every time the wind picks up. I had just settled into the couch with my laptop when I heard the faint scrape of something sliding through the mail slot. At first, I thought it was just another bill or some flyer for a local plumbing service. But when I picked it up, I noticed the envelope was unmarked. No return address, no stamp, not even my name on it. Just plain white, sealed, and heavy like there was more inside than just a sheet of paper. I hesitated, standing there in the doorway with the envelope in my hands. It didn't feel dangerous. Just off. I opened it carefully, sliding my thumb under the seal. Inside was a single sheet of lined paper, written in a handwriting that looked hurried but still legible. It's been a while and I've been thinking about you. I hope you're doing okay. No signature. No name. Just that sentence. I sat down at the kitchen table, turning the letter over, searching for some clue. Nothing. The handwriting wasn't familiar. It wasn't the kind of letter you'd expect from an old friend or family member. It didn't feel warm or nostalgic, it just felt hollow. I went through the usual suspects in my head. Maybe it was a prank? Someone from work messing with me? Or maybe a neighbor, though I barely know the people in my neighborhood. That night, I put the letter in a drawer and tried to forget about it. But I couldn't stop thinking about it. The next morning there was another letter. Same unmarked envelope, same lined paper. This time the message was shorter. Don't worry. I'm close. I called my sister Lynn in Savannah. She's the only person who might know about this sort of thing. Lynn laughed it off at first, joking that I finally had a secret admirer. But when I read the second letter to her, her voice got serious. Are you sure you haven't been talking to anyone new? Like online? She asked. I told her no. I've been out of the dating scene for a while and I'm not active on social media. Just work, home, and the occasional stop at the grocery store. Maybe it's nothing, she said, though I could hear the doubt in her voice. The third letter came yesterday. This one was different. You were wearing the green hoodie. You always look better in blue. I froze. I had worn my green hoodie the day before. To the coffee shop down the street. To the bank. I couldn't remember exactly where, but I hadn't seen anyone who looked suspicious, no one watching me. I tried to think logically. Maybe this was someone I knew, someone who'd seen me out and wanted to mess with me. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it was something else, something worse. I looked at the letter again. The handwriting hadn't changed. Still rushed, still unfamiliar. But something about the tone felt sharper, more deliberate. I haven't told Lynn about the third letter yet. I don't know what she'd say. Probably something like, you should call the police, or stay with me for a while. But what would I tell the police? That someone sent me 3 weird letters? That they might know what I wore yesterday? It's not exactly a crime. The fourth letter came this morning. You're doing better at hiding, but I'll see you soon. I don't think I'm leaving the house today. Or tomorrow. I don't even want to look out the window. I don't know who this person is or what they want. All I know is I wish I had thrown away that first letter. There's something about a near-empty bar after midnight that feels wrong. It's too quiet, too still, like the world outside doesn't exist anymore. Last Friday, that feeling crawled under my skin for the first time in years. It started just after 1 a.m. The regulars had all gone home and I was wiping down the counter, thinking about closing early when the door creaked open. A man stepped inside. He was tall, gaunt, and soaked from the rain. His clothes clung to him awkwardly and he carried a smell, earthy like wet soil. I figured he was just another drifter, someone down on his luck looking to escape the storm for a while. But the way he looked at me, there was something off. His eyes were wide, unblinking, like he hadn't slept in days. He didn't say a word, just walked to the bar and sat in the stool closest to the exit. What'll it be? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He hesitated, glancing at the bottles behind me like he didn't recognize them. Then he said, whiskey. Neat. I poured him a glass and slid it over. He didn't drink it, just stared at it, fingers drumming softly on the counter. Rough night? I asked, more out of habit than curiosity. He finally looked up at me and for a split second I saw something in his face, something that made my stomach twist. It wasn't fear or sadness. It was relief. You could say that, he muttered. Then, leaning closer, he added, you ever feel like you're being followed? I froze, unsure how to respond. Can't say I have, I said carefully. He nodded like he expected that answer. They don't always show themselves, you know. Sometimes they just linger. The way he said it sent a chill down my spine, but I forced a laugh. Who's they? He didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out something small and metallic. A coin. He placed it on the counter, spinning it with his fingers. It was old, tarnished, with strange engravings I couldn't make out. "This," he said quietly, "is how they mark you." "Mark you for what?" "For watching." I didn't know what to say to that, but something in his tone made me uneasy. I glanced at the clock, silently willing the minutes to move faster. "Listen, buddy," I said, forcing a casual tone. "If you're in some kind of trouble, maybe you should—" Before I could finish, the lights flickered. Once, twice, then went out completely. The room was plunged into darkness, except for the faint glow of the neon sign outside. I reached for my phone to use the flashlight, but the man's voice stopped me. "They're here," he whispered. I froze. "Who's here?" He didn't answer. Instead, he stood up abruptly, knocking over his glass. The whiskey spilled across the counter, but he didn't seem to notice. His eyes were fixed on the far corner of the room, where the shadows seemed darker than they should have been. I followed his gaze, my pulse hammering in my chest. At first I saw nothing. Just the empty booths and the flickering light from outside. But then, something moved. It wasn't a person. It wasn't even a shape I could describe. It was like the shadows themselves were shifting, pooling together into something almost human but not quite. "Do you see it now?" the man asked, his voice trembling. I wanted to say no, to tell him he was imagining things, but the words wouldn't come out. Because I did see it. And whatever it was looking at us. The man grabbed my arm, his grip ice cold. "They don't let you leave once they've found you. You have to." The lights came back on, and just like that, the shadow was gone. The man let go of me, his face pale and drenched in sweat. "I shouldn't have come here," he muttered, stumbling toward the door. "Wait." I called after him, but he was already gone, disappearing into the rain. I stood there for a long time, staring at the empty stool and the spilled whiskey. When I finally moved to clean up, I noticed something on the counter. The coin. I didn't touch it. Didn't even go near it. I just left it there, locked up, and went home. The next day, I found out the man had been hit by a car less than 2 blocks from the bar. They said he died instantly. But when I told the police what happened, they said no one matching his description had come in that night. And yet, the coin was still there, exactly where he left it. There's something about the Whispering Woods that I'll never forget. It's not the stories or the legends, but what happened to my friend Nina. I still can't wrap my head around it, and sometimes late at night I hear her voice. Nina and I had always been drawn to mysteries, but she was the braver one. When we heard about the woods in that sleepy little town, she insisted we check it out. I tagged along reluctantly, but deep down I already had a bad feeling. The townsfolk avoided us when we mentioned the forest. They wouldn't even look at us, let alone talk. Only one man, an old-timer with shaky hands, decided to indulge Nina's curiosity. "They don't whisper to everyone," he said, his voice barely a rasp. "Only those who listen." Nina laughed it off, but his words crawled under my skin. I told her we should leave it alone, but she shook her head. "If everyone's scared, there's definitely a story there," she said. The next day she went into the woods. I stayed behind, sitting on the porch of the inn, trying to convince myself she'd be fine. Hours passed. The sun dipped lower and my unease grew stronger. By the time it was nearly dark, I decided to go after her. The moment I stepped into the woods, the air changed. It was colder, heavier, and felt wrong. The trees were unnaturally still, their gnarled branches reaching like claws. Every step I took made my stomach twist tighter. Then I heard them, the whispers. At first they were faint, like the wind teasing the leaves. But they grew louder, closer. Words I couldn't quite make out slid past my ears, brushing against my mind. "Nina?" I called, my voice trembling. The whispers paused, and for a fleeting moment, I thought it was just my imagination. But then I heard it. Her voice. "Help me." It was faint, distant, but unmistakably hers. Panic gripped me and I started running, calling her name. "Nina, where are you?" The whispers surged around me, overlapping and chaotic. They weren't just random murmurs anymore, they were voices, distinct and terrifying. "Turn back. Stay. Run." I stumbled into a clearing, and that's when I saw her. She was standing there, her back to me, motionless. "Nina!" I shouted, rushing toward her. She didn't move. Her head tilted slightly, as if she were listening to something I couldn't hear. "Nina, we need to go," I said, grabbing her arm. She turned slowly and my heart sank. Her face, God, her face, was pale and blank, her eyes unfocused. But worst of all was her expression. She wasn't scared. She wasn't sad. She was empty. "They're here," she whispered, her voice flat and hollow. Before I could react, the whispers erupted into a deafening roar. Shapes began to form in the shadows, people or what used to be people. Their faces were twisted in anguish, their glowing eyes fixated on us. I pulled on Nina's arm, trying to drag her away, but she wouldn't budge. "You listened," she said, her voice no longer her own. "Now you'll stay." Her hand shot out, gripping my wrist with impossible strength. I screamed, yanking myself free, and stumbled backward. The shadows surged toward her, engulfing her form. Her face disappeared into the darkness, but her eyes lingered in my mind, wide and pleading. I ran. I don't know how I found my way out, but I did. When I reached the edge of the woods, the whispers stopped. The air was still again, almost peaceful. I told the townsfolk what happened. They didn't seem surprised. They just shook their heads and muttered something about how the woods always take what they want. We searched for Nina, but there was nothing left. Only her recorder lying in the dirt, untouched. Sometimes late at night I play the recording, hoping for answers. All I hear are the whispers, faint and distant. And if I listen long enough, I swear I hear her voice among them, calling my name.